This is the latest installation of an event, of a series we've been doing now for 6-7 years now at this point, called the New York City Russia Public Policy Series. It is generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and so we're very grateful for their funding. Today's session is, we're going to go out on a limb and call it Putin's fifth term. We have an incredibly distinguished set of panelists here. I'm incredibly looking forward to hearing from all of them and their insights on what's to come and what will follow. I want to just take 1 second before I turn it over to Alex to go over the logistics of how these work. Most of us are familiar with webinars by this point. I'm assuming most of you have actually even been to Jordan Center ones and New York City Russia Public Policy ones before. But the process that we're going to use for this is we've asked each of the panelists to prepare about 10 to 12 minutes of remarks. Alex will introduce each of them in turn with a very sort of short introduction. There'll be more information about our panelists in the bio. After that, we'll have question and answer, but because it's a webinar, we will get questions from you, the audience, via the Q&A tool. If you're watching on YouTube, we'll look at the comments on YouTube as well. And the nice thing about the Q&A tool is that you can use it at any time. You're not interrupting the speakers or anything like that. So if a question comes into your head while somebody's speaking, you can just jot it down in the Q&A. Alex and I will ask some of our own questions, and we'll look to the questions in the Q&A tool as well. I do want to point out that we will try to be respectful of everybody's time, and so we're going to end closely. We're going to end as close as we can to at the scheduled time of 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. And with that in mind, if we get a lot of questions, we'll sometimes try to combine a bunch of them to synthesize across them so we can get more of them out there. Anyway, with that, again, welcome to all of you. Thanks for spending part of your day with us here today. And I'm going to turn it over to Alex to introduce our speakers. Alex?
Thanks so much, Josh. It's a pleasure to be co-hosting this event with you again. So today's topic, Putin's fifth term, regime evolution and future challenges, on March 17th, just 11 days away. I think we can all safely predict that President Vladimir Putin is likely to be reelected again. So we are asking our distinguished panelists to weigh in on questions like, what will the fifth presidential term look like? What are any domestic threats to the Kremlin, especially in the wake of the tragic death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny? Can the war in Ukraine, or will it undermine the regime's stability? And what is this evolving relationship between Putin on the one hand and Russia's elites and the public? So four really distinguished scholars and researchers, and we'll just go in the order of the program. First up, Professor Regina Smith, who is professor of political science at Indiana University, author of multiple books, including the recent elections, protests, and authoritarian regime stability, Russia 2008 to 2020. Over to you.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for having me. It seems like we did this already in 2018, exactly this talk, and I think sometimes it's a little demoralizing to be here again with some of the same themes. But let me kick off by saying, as with the past election, this isn't really an election for most people in Russia. This is a political performance, and it's a political performance that means different things to different people. The election outcome is already determined. The Kremlin has announced what the results would be, and they'll hit those marks. They'll be extraordinarily high. I think something close to 90% support for Putin, with turnout higher than the last election, higher than 60%. For the Kremlin, this result will be touted as a rally around the flag effect. So we haven't really seen a genuine rally around the flag effect in Russia. We don't see people rushing to, we do see some people volunteering. We see some people making YouTube videos, but we don't see lots of people volunteering to go to war. We don't see people publicly demonstrating spontaneously their support for the war. Instead, the regime is pushing the war off the political agenda, out of sight. And I think that's important to remember when we think about this outcome and what it means, that as unbelievable as it is to us and how sad it is, most people don't see this war as the central issue in their lives, or many don't. And when we think about analyzing Russia, we have to take that point seriously. For the core supporters of Putin, the 30 to 35% who believe in the regime, in the war, who hold the conservative values that the Kremlin has touted, for these people, it is a real election. It's a chance for them to go out and show their support. It's a chance for them to demonstrate to others what they think. And it's a very important group because it projects onto the rest of Russia that it's impossible to distinguish in the contemporary situation where speech is so problematized, how big this group actually is. And so to have a 30 to 35% core, maybe even edging towards 40, is a huge ballast in producing these huge election results, but it's also huge in priming Russian society to think of what the majority thinks and how they process new information, given that understanding. There's also a large part of Russia who is checked out and delegating to the regime. These folks will show up as told. This is probably another third of the electorate who are compliant, but only because, not only because that's glib, but because they don't see a solution or a personal decision or agency that they can use to get out of it. In recent work that I have done on Russian conservative values right before the war, we see 40% of the population who express anti-conservative values. They express anti sort of militaristic patriotism, anti-happy family values, sort of anti-Putin narratives. For these people, the election is an opportunity or a forced moment to have to think about what's happening in Russia. And that's one of the reasons I think it's important. And these may be people who simply don't like the Putin policies as they're playing out in the local level, or people who simply think Putin's too old. We hear this if you watch YouTube videos of local protests, you hear a lot. He's old, he doesn't understand what's happening, right? A message we're all familiar with. And then there are also people who really don't like the war. And these people, some of them will go into the ballot box and say, what would Alexei Navalny tell me to do? He would say protest, right? Use my vote as a protest. And in that sense, I think the Navalny death, murder, makes this election harder for Putin, that more people will be trying to use the vote as a protest vote to do what Navalny posthumously seems to have asked today, which is go to the polling spaces at 12 o'clock en masse and vote for spoil your ballot or vote for anybody but Putin. Navalny is now out there sort of putting electoral protest strategies out. And in this sense, it means that people will be talking, people will have to confront their beliefs, people will have to think about how they feel about this regime. And in that sense, it's very meaningful. I will say that Russians are not alone in not understanding how manipulated their elections are. This regime has built electoral manipulation over more than a decade and a half. The tools that most people think as electoral manipulation, like ballot stuffing or this carousel voting where people are bussed from precinct to precinct, we're going to see those videos, but most people will look at them and say, it's not that big. Of course, there's some electoral protest. Look at the United States. Even in the United States, there's issues with electoral manipulation. But this election is going to be won or manufactured in different places. It's going to be manufactured on unprotected online voting, on at-home voting, which is entirely unobserved. It's going to be manufactured over the multiple days of voting. And now it's going to be manufactured in the illegally annexed sections of Ukraine. So it's going to be manufactured out of the sight of most Russians, and it's going to create sort of disinformation or misunderstanding about what's happening. I will say that I do think that this makes workplace mobilization, the forcing people to go to the polls to vote, a little more problematic because you don't know what they're going to do with their ballot once they get in. So let me just say very briefly a few things about your question about social divisions. I think the turnout for the Navalny memorials first, which spread not only in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but also across Russia. There's an interesting piece out that starts to count other places where these small memorial events were taking place. Chuvashia is among the top places where it happened, right? So we see sort of diversity across Russia's regions. We saw discontent in Baimak, in Bashkortostan, where this wasn't only about the proximate arrest of the leader of the Bashkir movement and the sentencing, but about long-held grievances about this administration and the demise of support for this regime. And also, it revealed, importantly, some elite social movement connections, networks that had emerged in Bashkortostan to grow these movements, right? And that's a snapshot of what's happening in two events. And I think when we think about Russian public opinion, we see sort of support for getting out of the war increasing. We see absolute support for the war decreasing marginally. It's hard to interpret these polls for sure, but we are seeing some cracks that reflect longer-term discontent with the regime that go beyond just the war. And I think that the challenges are going to be to balance the economic, social, and spiritual cost of the war against these other costs of lack of modernization, lack of delivery on state policies, poor delivery on state policies, corruption, and repression and control. So I'll stop there. I have lots and lots to say about this topic, but let me stop there and yield to my colleagues.
Yeah, thanks so much. And yes, I remember when we did this before, but of course, every time is a different nuance and a different flavor. So we're really grateful to you for kicking off the analysis. Next off, we go to Samuel Green, who is Director for Democratic Resilience at the Center for European Policy and Analysis at CEPA. And Sam is also a professor of Russian politics at King's College, London, and also no stranger to the Harriman Institute. Sam, what are you analyzing or looking for in this election?
Thanks for the question. Thanks for the invitation. First of all, it's very great to be with everybody here, although at a difficult moment for us to do what we do, both I think because what we do is troubling, but also because I think our ability to do it is diminished, and we've been saying that for a couple of years now. But I think it feels particularly acute, at least to me, at the moment. The reality is there's a lot that we don't know, and I think we need to be very circumspect about that, right? And be very careful not to sort of impute our own wishful thinking or worst fears for that matter into the black boxes, right, that we have trouble accessing. The issue for me is less about data quality. And there's a lot of people out there, raising questions about whether we can trust the polls. To me, that's not the issue. To me, the issue is the access to the social space and the context that allows us to actually interpret what we're seeing in the numbers. Poll numbers are always an abstraction. They're always several levels of causation, right, removed from the things going on in people's minds and in people's lives. And we always need that access to the lives that people are living, right, to be able to understand what we're actually seeing. And right now, that's something that very, very few of us have. Certainly, I don't have. And as a result, I'm less and less confident in my ability to understand what's going on. And on some level, maybe I should just stop there. But because this is my job, I guess I won't. I think, building on, but differing from, to a certain extent, some of the things that Regina was talking about. I won't get into the dynamics of public opinion as such, but there are parts of that we can debate, I suppose. I think broadly, I'm looking at two sort of contradictory sets of observations, right? One is a population that is remarkably inert. Right. And that despite some of the things that we've seen that Regina's pointed to, protests in Bashkortostan, people showing up for, Navalny's funeral, and that sort of thing, right? We have seen a scale and a duration of political and economic shock, right? So the war in the first place, at least the initial effects of sanctions, which have certainly smoothed out since then. Prigozhin's mutiny, military call-ups and that sort of thing, right? That have produced no discernible changes in social behavior and political behavior. We've seen what I might call status shocks, right? So we've seen people's ability to live the lives the way that they were living them. It's not just a material thing, right? But even if people's material livelihoods aren't reduced, their ability to travel the world, to access aspects of the globe the way that they used to interact with their family members and their friends, many of whom have left the country. We've seen, again, very little discernible response to that. We've seen moral shocks in the form of the war itself, and pictures coming back from the front lines and from Ukrainian cities. I think there was a period of time very early in the war when we could have believed that many Russians didn't really know what was going on. I think that's not a tenable assumption anymore. Most people, I think, have access to information on the reality of the war, and the regime isn't really hiding the reality of the war. We've had physical shocks, right? We've had attacks on Russian cities. We've had Russian oil refineries blowing up. We've had drones hitting, skyscrapers in central Moscow. Again, things that the regime isn't particularly hiding, right? But no real response. We've had, even within that part of the Russian population that is opposition-minded and anti-war minded, right? We've had two anti-war candidates barred from running in the presidential election, Katerina Tuntsova and Boris Nadezhdin. You had, in the first case, tens of thousands of people that had mobilized to support a candidacy, and hundreds of thousands that had, or plausibly hundreds of thousands that had mobilized. In Nadezhdin's case, we all saw the pictures of people lining up to sign the petitions. And frankly, the reaction to their removal from the ballot or barring from the ballot was crickets, right? We saw nothing tangible. We've seen more than that in response to the murder of Alexei Navalny, and that is striking. I think that there will be some questions that we'll want to pay attention to with that, not necessarily with regard to the elections, but to see how that goes. We'll see what happens on election day, whether the call to show up at noon for a protest is heeded. But I think broader question is whether people in that sort of opposition ecosystem look at the numbers of people, probably as many as 25,000 people who showed up around the country for various memorials, whether they see that as more than they expected, in which case it can be energizing, or whether they see that as simply not enough to be meaningful, in which case it will be demobilizing. Again, I don't have access to the dinner table conversations, right, at which people will be sorting out that perception. So that's one set of observations. The second set of observations is that the regime is continuing to treat the public as threatening despite this inertia, right? So we see a very risk-averse approach to policing grassroots noncompliance as opposed to opposition, right? So it's policing the hell out of the opposition, and that's been true since at least 2019. When it's people trying to take themselves out of harm's way, right? People trying to either leave the country to avoid the military call-up, or to bribe their way out of military service, or other sorts of things of that variety. As long as it's not a collective appeal to challenge federal or even local governance. We're seeing the state basically leave people to get on with their lives, much as it has, right, for the duration of Putin's time in office. We're seeing, I think, a pretty risk-averse approach to the elections, right? They're not trying a lot of new things. In fact, they seem to be going through most of the motions that they usually do. Regina already outlined a lot of what they'll be doing, but despite the fact that there's reason to believe that workplace and locality, neighborhood mobilization and forced voting might not be productive, the signals that they're doing it anyway. And that people will be expected to meet their targets. We're seeing a risk-averse approach to the war itself, right? They are deciding to be happy with the number of men that they're able to get on the front line, and I will be very skeptical that they will pivot to a large-scale military mobilization even after the elections. Generally speaking, the regime continues to avoid placing new or unfamiliar demands on the population. Right? They don't want to provoke a response by providing an unnecessary stimulus, despite the fact that the population has proven remarkably accommodating of new and unfamiliar demands and stimuli, right, over the course of the last 2 years. So I'll be honest, again, I'm struggling to sort of interpret what I think are two contradictory things, right? A population that should be available to the regime in mobilizational ways, and a regime that doesn't seem to want to rely on that capacity. A long time ago, I used to write about an idea that I called aggressive immobility, right? This idea that essentially Russians are in fact, very defensive of the resources that they have in their lives. They don't like to be pushed out of that, and they will push back against the state when the state does things that disrupts their livelihoods and their sort of individualized coping mechanisms. That idea would have suggested that at least some of these shocks should have provoked a response. And that means, I think, for me, one of two things. Either my idea was wrong in the first place, which is entirely plausible, or something else is suppressing those responses, and repression and sort of the ambient sense of repression that has, I think, increased over the last 2 years is a good guess or as to what might be preventing some of those responses from coming to the fore. The regime, though, is not, again, behaving as though it can rely on fear to procure compliance, right? So it's leaving intact kind of the structures of involution and aggressive immobility and the avenues that people have to sort of secede from compliance individually, as long as they don't secede from compliance collectively. And I would expect that to continue into the fifth term as well. So just sort of a final thought on that fifth term. Probably not terribly surprisingly, right? It's hard to find anything that looks like a political platform from Putin. If you look at his campaign website or his speeches, he's not really saying anything about the future. Neither are any of the other candidates. Nadezhdin was wanting to talk about the future, but he's not a candidate. Navalny talked about the future probably more powerfully than anybody else, and we'll see whether that resonates, even though that he's not able to be the one talking. But Andrei Kolesnikov over at Carnegie has written very eloquently about sort of the purposeful failure of political imagination, the suppression of political imagination in Russia. And I think that is Putin's agenda for the fifth term, to extend as long as possible this sort of what to paraphrase Andrei is, you could see as sort of the tyranny of the everlasting present, right? That nothing can ever change. We simply need to live in this moment, and as Regina suggested, it is for many Russians a tolerable moment, even if it's not perfect. And so I think the task for the regime is to try to make this moment seem as tolerable as possible for as long as possible. But that does put it in a very risk-averse stance, and perhaps a fairly brittle stance as a result of that. So if there's a silver lining, it's that brittleness. But we've been talking about this regime being brittle for a long time. So I'll stop there and let somebody else pick up on the optimism somewhere.
Yes, we have. Sam, thanks so much. Insightful as always. Next up is Brian Taylor, who is a professor of political science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University and director of the Moynihan Institute of Global Affairs. Brian specializes in the politics of Russia and the Russian state, especially state coercive organizations like the police and the military, as well as their relationship with elites. What's your perspective on this?
Great. Thanks, Alex and Josh, and thanks everyone for being here. So as Alex implied, I'm going to talk more about the state in general and also the so-called Siloviki in particular, and also talk a bit more broadly about quote unquote elites. In terms of presidential terms, I'm not going to talk about the coronation, by the way, but in terms of these terms, right, starting the fifth term, they don't really matter that much because Russia's not a democracy. Since Putin returned in 2012, I would say the key turning points were 2014, invasion of Crimea, 2020, the rewriting of the Constitution, and obviously 2022, the full-scale invasion, not 2018 and not 2024. If 2024 proves to be an important turning point in Russian politics, it'll be because of the murder of Navalny or something that happens in the war. It won't be because of the results we'll see in a couple of weeks. So I'm going to talk about four main themes, one having to do with personalism and the elites, one having to do with what we used to call in the field known as Soviet studies as stability and cadres, a bit about loyalty and about what some people are calling negative loyalty, and then concluding with a few challenges. So first on the elites, there's been this long-standing conception of Putin as kind of the arbiter between different elite groupings. And I want to suggest that that's not a really very useful way of thinking about this anymore. And so I'll give you a couple of quotes from a couple of prominent Russian observers. First, Andrei Pertsov, who writes for Meduza. He writes, "The elite in the usual sense has ceased to exist. They have become servants. Servants who can be useful to the president and can do his bidding. They can fight for his attention and favor. They can embellish reality or decorate it to the president's liking, but they cannot influence the process of making key decisions." Second observer, Tatyana Stanovaya, "We do not have an elite that one could consider a political force which has a plan, ambitions, and agenda. There is no such force. There is only Putin and an apparatus serving him." I think that's more or less right. There has been a view for quite a while that Putin is useful to the elites as someone who keeps the system in balance, resolves disputes, keeps everyone satisfied. So the relationship is depicted as symbiotic and mutually beneficial. And I'm not saying that's gone away entirely, but it's really more a relationship between the czar and his courtiers. It's more one way than two way. And they're serving him, and even more so, I think, in wartime. Now, obviously, Putin can't make every decision himself. He relies upon the presidential administration and lots of his people, both in and outside the state. But I think it's more a dynamic of what they call in Nazi studies working towards the Führer, right? You're trying to anticipate what the great leader wants and deliver it to him rather than bargaining with him. And I think the war, both starting in 2014, but now especially in 2022, has enhanced this dynamic. All right, so that's the first sort of key theme. Talking more specifically about the so-called Siloviki, so these are people from the military and security services and law enforcement apparatus. Polls consistently show over more than 2 decades now that this is the group that Russians think Putin represents more than any other group, more than average people, more than middle class, more than economic elites. They think it's about the bureaucracy in general and about the Siloviki in particular. As I always try and say when I talk about them, this is not a unified group. We often talk about them as if they are, but they are not. Even within the different agencies that we can think of, they're not unified agencies, and there are different groupings in those agencies. So with that as a proviso, I did want to note a remarkable degree of stability at the top of these structures. So the Secretary of the Security Council, Patrushev, he's been in this position for 16 years. He's 72 years old. The head of the Federal Security Service, Bortnikov, has been in his position 16 years also. He is also 72 years old. The head of the investigative committee, Bastrykin, depends a bit on how you count, but at least 13 years. One might say 17. And he's 70 years old. Minister of Defense Shoigu, been in the position 11 years now, and he's 68 years old. Head of the Interior Ministry, the sort of main policing agency, Kolokholtsev, has been there 12 years. He's actually relatively young compared to the rest of them. He's 62. And the head of Rosgvardia, sometimes called the National Guard, Zolotov, he's been around, again, depending on how you count, in this role, 8 to 10 years, obviously in an important role before as well. He's 70 years old. Director of the Foreign Intelligence Service, Narishkin, is in his position now 7.5 years, and he's 69. So that's just some of the people, right? 5 of those 7 are from Petersburg. And Putin keeps these loyalists, these familiar faces around. There's been rumors for a long time that some of them are going to be leaving, but they're all still hanging around. And one might say that this stability in cadres is despite some pretty spectacular failures on the part of some of these agencies, including the FSB, in the military, both with respect to the invasion, but also various foreign intelligence operations, the whole Prigozhin affair, et cetera. Now, Putin himself might not see these as failures, but at least some of them, I think there are reasons to have questions about, but these are his loyal servants, and they're not really up for punishment. All right, thinking more broadly about the elite and state officials in particular, there was a time when observers, I think, were more optimistic about public administration reform, the quality of cadres coming through the different training agencies, Higher Education Institute, Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, learning the modern tools and ethos of public administration like we teach here at the Maxwell School, that kind of stuff. But ultimately, the system remade them. They did not remake the system. Sistema, as some people refer to it, proved much more powerful. To the extent we can know about this, and I agree with Sam, there's a lot of opacity there, given restrictions on travel, et cetera. But it doesn't seem that many of these people think particularly strategically. They're fatalistic, they're task-oriented, they follow orders, they live in the present, they don't think about the future, and to a certain extent, they have blinders about the path Russia is on and don't want to engage with that. And some Russian scholars have been using this term negative loyalty. So they're referring to Hirschman's famous trilogy of exit, voice, and loyalty, which I want to unpack too much, but exit means sort of leaving the system. The cost for that for the elites is really high. Voice, speaking out, the cost of that are even higher. So these officials aren't choosing either of those options, but the loyalty doesn't necessarily mean they have fully signed on to the war, have fully signed on to Putin's agenda, but they don't see any alternatives, so they keep doing what they've been doing. All right, finally, a couple comments on challenges to think about, and I'm not going to even talk about the 2 most obvious ones. Perhaps Irina will get to this, or perhaps it'll come up in questions, but the 2 most obvious ones are the future of the war and what's going on with the economy. I think if we think about challenges for this next period of time, those would have to be at the top of the list. In terms of the sorts of people I study, the Siloviki, the repressive apparatus seems to have the domestic situation very much under control, as Sam sort of said already. And I think we see this in the Navalny response, or the response to Navalny's murder and the funeral and, the coming out of the population. The response was not, crackheads, roundup crowds, that kind of thing. They let people came out, they filmed who was there, they used facial identification technology to go visit people later who they observe in the crowd and, give them a warning, that kind of thing. So they managed that event in a way that was designed not to provoke further sort of outpouring. We'll see where this goes, but at the moment, it's a very repressive system, but also flexible enough to manage situations like this. So there don't seem to be any spaces right now for challenges from the streets or challenges from the elites. And Putin and the presidential administration have a pretty good grip on the coercive apparatus, on rents, the flow of economic rents in the system, and control over the information space. Now, a second thing to think about in these terms, and it contradicts what I just said, saying they had a firm control over coercion. Some of us might remember the distant days of the Prigozhin mutiny, which was a shock to the system and a shock to many of us, came out of nowhere. In many ways humiliating for Putin himself and the power ministries more generally. The director of the CIA, Bill Burns, who at one point was ambassador to Moscow, has this great quote about how the emperor seems to, excuse me, have no clothes, or at least is taking a very long time to get dressed. A lot of people apparently weren't answering the phone that weekend, were waiting to see what to do, playing things very cautiously. But now that seems all in the past. But I do wonder if anyone within the system has really forgotten some of the lessons from that, which is someone who's allowed to develop, their own coercive force can drive on the Capitol with basically little opposition. That was something we hadn't seen in decades, and coming right out of a very repressive, seemingly very loyal Putinist system. That was a bit of a shock. I'm over time, I think, by about 30 seconds, but I did want to make one final point, and it's about renewal and it's about aging. I talked about stability in cadres. Putin's been in power 25 years or so. Many of these people have been with him the whole time. I gave you the numbers of some of these people above. But if we look at another cross-section of the elite, the so-called Politburo 2.0 that Yevgeny Minchenko talks about, he has 13 members in that current sort of Politburo, the key insiders. Their average age is 68. In 1982, when Leonid Brezhnev died, the average age of the Politburo was 70. So we're approaching that gerontocracy level. So I think there's a question about, will some of these people need to be replaced? Will Putin want to replace some of them? Who might, fill in for those positions? We know about some of the younger bodyguards, some of the princelings, right, kids of the people around him. But I think it's an open question over the next, 5 years. How will the system handle an aging leadership, and what capacity will it have for renewal? And I will stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Brian, and also for that intriguing analogy regarding age and the gerontocracy. So let me just encourage everyone to type in your questions into the Q&A. We already have a few. And as we go to our final speaker on our program is Enina Busina, who is a research fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Also, we're lucky to have her teaching a class at Harriman. Till 2022, she worked as a professor of comparative politics at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the Higher School of Economics at St. Petersburg, Russia, and headed the Center for Comparative Governance Studies. Enina, welcome.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much, Josh and Antoine. You can hear me well, right? I always need to ask this question. Thank you. And thank you for the audience and for the invitation. And I'm going to talk about center-regional relations, this dimension you should never forget in discussing what will be with the Putin's fifth term or whatever term, taking into consideration Russia's territorial size and diversity. And what I will do, I structured my presentation as follows, my 10 minutes. First, I will be very brief, telling you about the model, just about the model of the current model of the center-regional relations, just very brief. And then I try to identify the trends which probably would be, I think, probably, this is a guess, but still will be relevant for the fifth term of Putin, and there are 4 of them. And 2 of them are about the new developments within the regional administrations, and the other 2 trends are about the restructuring of the Russian economic and probably political space. So I will start with the model. So we know that, okay, Russia is a federation, but Russia is not a federation. And what kind of place are the regional governments occupy in this system? And this is important so that we would have the starting point. And in this current model of center-regional relations, so the governors are there. They are definitely not the public politicians, how you would expect them to be in a genuine democratic federation. This is one thing. They are not public politicians accountable to their original population. However, they are also not the how they are often described, that they are the passive subordinates and they are just the agents, passive agents, or even the victims of the angry Putin, of this terrible system. And this is kind of power vertical, kind of the total control of Putin and Kremlin and Kiriyenko from the presidential administration over the governors. I would say this is a simplistic view because this is not the case. And the case is that, and this is important, that the governors are neither public politicians, nor they are the victims and the subordinates, but they are the stakeholders. And they are interested in maintaining the political status quo as much as the Putin himself or the Kremlin himself is interested. This is how their incentive structure, this is how their incentives work. And this is what we see, by the way, from the Putin fifth point to the day that we are, here today. We had a test for the system, and this was the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So this was this system, and this was a very telling test how the system is functioning, and it is functioning. It is robust. It is resilient. It implies no. This is what Brian also mentioned. This is about bargaining. This is no bargaining. The bargaining is absolutely excluded from this system. And however, they are the stakeholders, so the regional governors. They during the COVID-19 pandemic, they were not only taken, just passively taken the new assignments or the new zones of responsibility for Moscow, but they were taken this enthusiastically. They were manipulating the COVID-19 statistic for Moscow, for the center, and many other things. Okay, just having said that, this model is robust. This model is resilient. However, what I was trying to do, and now I'm coming to this, I was trying to identify, are there something new? Are there any trends in this system which looks so resilient? And again, I try to identify, I identified four. The first is the what is going on the regional level with the war. It started with the war, and this is ever expanding. This is the expanding of the social patronage of the governors over the people who are convicts or who go to the front line because voluntary, or quasi-voluntary, signing the contracts and having money for this. But so this is the crisis of the war is ever expanding. So these are the families, these are the children, these are material. You have to support them materially. You have to give at least some information to those families, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of byproducts, the social byproducts of war. And what do they need from the governors? And this is what we try to discuss with my co-author Mikhail Filipov in our recent Ponas memo. This is the new qualities. Okay, probably the governors are not, they are not making the war, did not make from the governors the public politicians. This is not. However, what changed is that they are not technocrats, because as you remember, this was the very kind of popular idea. These are technocrats. Now that to be a technocrat is not enough. It is not enough because you have to communicate. You have to show your support. You have to communicate with the various groups. Also with this, in particular, with the wives of the mobilized, and so on and so forth. These are different qualities. And this is the trend number one. And the trend number two, also related to the regional administration, is very different. And pointing, at probably the different direction. What Putin, what Putin said during his address to the Federal Assembly in the last day of February this year, right? what he was saying, he said, кому мы можем доверить Россию? Whom can we entrust Russia to? Sure, to the heroes, And then he came forward with a new initiative, which I even don't want to talk about the name, Время героев, the time of heroes. The time of heroes are coming now to Russia. And this time of heroes are not coming only to Moscow, but to the region. Because what was initiated previously, it was prior to his speech, but he kind of announced it publicly to the whole Russia, this time of heroes. This is for whom? This is an initiative similar to the School of Governors and to the School of Mayors. There they made selections, right? Selection. Not the people by chance are going to the regional elections, but the people are selected, previously selected by the presidential administration. And now this is a new cohort, the new group of the people. These are not technocrats anymore, but these are the people from the military experience and which would have higher education. Do you know how many submissions they already had? In this very few days of March, over 15,000. Over 15,000 people. So these people, where are they going to go? Where, где им будет доверена Россия? So where are they going to go to be, to take care about Russia? They will go to the regions. They will go to the regions, and I would guess that in the regions, they would occupy, in the regional administrations, they would occupy a very special place because they are directly supported, by Moscow. They are special people. So I think that the composition of the regional administrations somehow, and probably, if I may use the word ideology, it's not a good word, but still, so it is probably would be a subject to change differently in different regions, right? However, for me, this is, again, so one trend is more communication and social patronage, while the other, how should I call it, the militarization of the regional administration, can I call it like that? These are the trends on the regional level. And I would also like to mention two trends on the level of the Russian, on the much broader level of the Russian territorial structure. What do I mean? When we had COVID, it was nothing like that. Nothing like that. What is going on in Russia is kind of a change of the trajectory, if you want. So this is the changing of Russian territorial structure. And this also should have implications for Russia-Center regional relations. So the trend number one here would be the advanced economic growth of the regions with a huge military-industrial complex, the clusters of these regions. So because these are the clusters, most of these regions with a huge development of military-industrial complex, which is on the rise now for understandable reasons. This is the center. So we would have two things like the center. So this is Tula, Yaroslavl, Tver, Kaluga. So this would be one kind of cluster of these regions. So this is it's nothing to compare. So the COVID-19 pandemic, because we compare sometimes. So this was this crisis, and now this is that crisis. In this respect, they cannot be compared at all because this is strategic. COVID-19 was tactic. All the people kind of the establishment was waiting when it will finish. Now this is a very different thing. The idea is to build a different country. For me, I understand this is very general and abstract. To build a different country, what does it mean? But still, but again, so we have these clusters of this region. So first we have them in the center, then we have them on the Volga region, right, close to Udmurtia, the Republic of Udmurtia, and then we have it in Ural. Ural, this is the most kind of the so this is the way military industrial the regions specialized on this. So this is, first of all, this is Chelyabinsk Oblast, Chelyabinsk region, and then this is Sverdlovsk region, plus the Omsk region. Okay, so this is one trend which will determine a lot, I think. This is the special trend, this is territorial trend. And the other trend would be the shift to the east. The shift to the east, which is very different agenda. Absolutely different agenda, but also accelerated with the war. Because Putin proclaimed the shift to the west, not now. but he proclaimed it after the annexation of Ukraine, right? And for several years, nothing particular happened. But the war was the main driver for really these huge investments, state investments to the Far East. This is not a war agenda, but it's a war-related agenda. The modernization of these territories with the idea of the reorientation of the trade flows from the Western markets, okay, this is the sanctions, to the Asian markets, with the huge investments to logistics, to infrastructure, and so on and so forth, to the development of the cities, special cities. So what I wanted to say that we observe, again, these are my guesses. Just wanted to draw your attention to the trends, and I can be mistaken, but still, I observe these trends on the level of the regional administrations, which could be, would they kind of be converted in the erosion of the model? I don't know, but at least they deserve to be kind of very carefully observed on the level of the regional administration, and then on the level of the restructuring of the whole territory of the country. Thank you very much, and I stop here.
Thank you, Irina. And I'm back. I apologize for my own technical difficulties. Josh, let's go to you for the first question.
Yeah, thanks everybody. This was really this was all fascinating and across the different, lots of different topics covered across these things. We've got some great questions in the Q&A. I want to encourage people who are listening to be able to use the Q&A if you're in the webinar, as well as if you're on YouTube, you can put questions in the chat there. The question that I want to kick this off with is, and I really appreciated that there were a number of different themes that emerged across the different discussions. One of which was this, what Sam, you're calling about this desire of the tyranny of the everlasting present, which I think Brian picked up very much when talking as well about the nature of the bureaucracy and cadre stability. My question is, though, how, if the idea of the fifth term is really going to be this idea of keeping people from thinking that there's anything that can disrupt this moment of the present, how do we then rectify that with the decision to invade Ukraine in the first place? After the seizure of Crimea, after the sort of, slow burn or frozen conflict that was emerging in the Donbass, that all seemed very amenable to this tyranny of the present. The invasion itself seems possible to have greatly disrupted that. So if I could just put you on the spot for a moment here, like how does this idea of the fifth term being about the tyranny of the present, does that lead us to go back and rethink the way we think about reasons why Putin might have invaded in the first place? Does it tell us something about what they've gotten out of the war, or does it say anything about how they might think about the war more in the future, or how the war has evolved? Because those two kind of seem a little bit of conflict with each other.
Oh, absolutely. This whole thing is in conflict, right? I mean, look, I am no closer to understanding the thought process that led Russia to war than I was, on the 25th of February in 2022, right? And I just have to acknowledge that, right? Grant Robertson and I had a piece in December 2021, right, arguing that war was possible. There's 200,000 troops on the border, right? But it didn't make sense, and I still think it didn't make sense. But one of the things that we got some things right in that, right? In that it was going to be a lot messier, I think, than the Kremlin expected it to. And I do think that's part of the explanation. I do think that the Kremlin genuinely believed this would be a much easier operation than it turned out to be. So I don't think the Kremlin ever anticipated being here. I think one of the reasons that they didn't anticipate being here, and maybe we're susceptible to wishful thinking about going into Ukraine, about the full-scale invasion, is that they were not sure that the Russian population would accommodate what it has at the end of the day accommodated, right? And that is one of the things that I think both the Kremlin got wrong to its benefit, and that Graham and I got wrong to our detriment, is that we thought that all of these shocks, which were kind of inevitable if you'd been paying attention to what was going on in Ukraine, would have an impact in Russian politics in ways that they haven't. And so I do think that yes, while the war could have upset the apple cart of that sort of everlasting present. In practice, it hasn't. That doesn't mean it can't upset it in the future. And I think that, thinking to the end of the next 6-year term, right, we can all see, problems arising in the economy. The top line numbers in the economy look, robust, but if you look at what's happening in terms of actual investment in productive capacity in the consumer economy and that sort of thing, right, they are setting themselves up for a whole raft of difficulties. But Putin doesn't have the luxury of thinking 6 years down the road, right? It's not just an age thing, right? He recognizes he has to remain in balance, right, at every step along the way. Winning the election, quote unquote, right, on the 17th of March does not guarantee him, another peaceful 6 years in office. So he, may not be thinking that far down the road. But it is, look, he's never been one to give people a vision of the future. He has always wanted people to be able to sort of imagine different futures for themselves. And if you go back to sort of the tandem with Medvedev, right, back in 2008, 2012, if you wanted to believe that Russia was going to modernize and be full of iPhones and freedom is better than non-freedom, then you could support Medvedev and see your future that way. And if you wanted to believe in a future of restored Russian greatness, and harking back to nostalgic images of the past, you could believe that too and support Putin. And at the end of the day, you were supporting the same thing, right? That is harder now, right? And so I think what he's tried to do is not to have people believing in the equal plausibility of different visions of the future, right? But just to submerge the whole concept of the future, right? To encourage people again to be as tolerant of the present as they can be. I think one of the interesting numbers when you look at the survey research that Levada is doing has to do with people's ability to think about the future. Right? So they have for a very long time been asking people, sort of how far out into the future you can project your lives. And the dominant number now is, not more than a couple of months. And that number is at a level that it has been stably since the war began. It's been that level of sort of uncertainty is where it was in 2001. Very, very early days of Putin's rule. I'd like to think at some point that comes back to bite him, but we're not seeing that now.
Yeah, so when we think, a big topic of discussion in regard to the war and in terms of what's happened more recently in the war and around the question of Western support for Ukraine is always, if not stopped in Ukraine, would Russia go further, right? Like, is this the beginning? And one way to read your remarks, Sam, is by saying there has been this, desire for the tyranny of the present, right? The never-ending tyranny of the present. I forget if that's exactly what the phrase you use. The invasion of Ukraine is supposed to be not disruptive of that because it's supposed to follow the pattern of Georgia or Crimea or something like that, be super easy and just continue this kind of gradualism. It doesn't work out that way. And so the regime, which wants to keep people from having too many of these kinds of shocks, is chastised a little bit by it, wants to finish it off, is pleasantly surprised you don't get these shocks domestically, but that this would lead to it being, restrained in the future because it realizes it doesn't have the ability to predict how these things will turn out. That seems to me like a different take than what a lot of people are sort of looking at what's happening in Ukraine right there. So Brian, maybe pass it over to you here to sort of just address this point as well about the discontinuity between the two, and perhaps is this scenario, this alternative scenario, one that's worth coming out in terms of how the Siloviki might be anticipating might be reacting to what happened in Ukraine, might be thinking about the future.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'm not quite seeing the contradiction between the tyranny of the everlasting present and the war in Ukraine, and let me explain why I think that. I mean, as a political system, it's a hegemonic electoral authoritarian regime where the same guy's been in power a long time, the same party dominates national and regional governance, right? And the whole point of a system like that is to communicate that there is no alternative to the current political order. So any possible alternatives that might appear on the scene are snuffed out in a variety of ways, right? Sometimes literally, but also, other ways to make sure that Putin is the centerpiece, that everyone expects him to be there forever. They don't have to even imagine any alternative to him, and they don't see any alternative because one is not presented or is able to be presented to them. So I think that, fits fairly naturally with the way some of these personalist dictatorships structure themselves and the way they try to hold on to power. But the other part of these personalist dictatorships are, to put it, bluntly, the personality of the person, right? And so I think if we're trying to explain the war, I agree with Sam that Putin didn't see any contradiction between maintaining the stability of his system and the so-called special military operation. But we have to talk about not only the tyranny of the everlasting present, but the tyranny of the ever-shifting past, in that Putin has come to the view, I think he's held it a very long time, but he became more kind of obsessed with it, about this artificial nature of Ukraine, that it's his mission as Tsar to, reunify or regather the Russian lands, right? Fiona Hill and Cliff Gaddy had their very good book on Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. They talk about 6 different personalities. There's the operative, there's the statist, there's the free marketeer. And one of the ones they talk about is History Man, right? This book came out in 2012, something like that. I don't remember exactly. And I've said this before, but I never thought at the time I read the book that History Man was going to be the dangerous one. But History Man turned out to be the dangerous one because he became obsessed with this vision and this flawed vision of Ukraine and Russia. People around him encouraged that worldview. I think we have some evidence of that. And building a personalist dictatorship, no one wants to tell the boss that he's got it wrong, right? So discordant messages are designed not to get into the decision-making process. And I think that's why they make this what I see as a mistake for the system. It hasn't threatened the system yet, but we'll see how the war and the economy develop. But I don't think he saw any contradiction between his role in history, the necessity of this step, and preserving a political order that's unchanging and eternal. And I know I've dodged the second question about where do we go from here, but I feel like I've talked enough, so I should be quiet, but I'm happy to come back to that later if there's time. So
great. All right, thanks. Yeah, and we're getting a lot of good questions in the Q&A here. I'm going to try to bundle 2 of them together that have a similar theme, although pointing in different directions. One is from Mikhail Filipov, who's asks, how do the panelists evaluate the chances for Russia to develop a stable and predictable democracy over the next 10 years, ensuring that it remains non-threatening to its neighbors and the international community? In this context, what strategic approach should Western nations adopt? Should they aim to isolate and diminish Russia's power akin to the approach taken with North Korea, or should they instead focus on fostering conditions that may lead to a successful democratization within Russia? At the same time, we also have a question from Harold Chambers saying that, pointing to a lot of the changes that the panelists have discussed that have happened since the 2020 pandemic, and asking how should these continuing changes to be understood? Should it be the end of the Putinist brand of authoritarianism and a shift towards a more classical totalitarian system? So Regina, I was thinking maybe I would pass this to you first. We've been talking about the tyranny of the present, but as we look towards a longer term future, right? Is there, well, first, is this the end of, is it the end of competitive authoritarianism or even classical authoritarianism and sliding towards totalitarianism as a framework we want to think about here? But then secondly, is there in this 10-year period a kind of path back towards democratization, or do we just have no idea at this point?
Thanks, Josh. So first of all, competitive authoritarianism died a decade ago. So I think we're really talking about a model of authoritarianism that relies equally on repression, disinformation, and coercion, and has a higher role for repression than we've been talking about when we talk about contemporary authoritarianism, which really stresses information politics over coercion and repression. One thing that comes up in all of these questions, but I think is really important for totalitarianism, is something Sam mentioned, and I think Brian did also, about state intervention in everyday lives. And totalitarian models, if you look at the checklist of totalitarianism, Putin has all of those things, right? He has an emerging, we can fight over ideology, and I would, but he has a dominant party, control of the media, all of the things that we call totalitarian. What he has been reluctant to do, what this regime is reluctant to do, is to interfere in people's everyday lives. And that is changing rapidly now. And it's changing for me in an extremely unexpected way. We talk a lot about Putin's masculinity, about masculine values, and a lot of other issues about the patriarchy of Russia. But what we've seen in the core support of Putin from, say, the early 2010s to right now is a shift away from core support being women and families and a reward for having made life more secure, to older men who support more patriarchal and militaristic patriotic values. So we see this in a whole range of surveys. We see this in interview data. We see this a lot in my data about young Russians who have left Russia, long interviews with young Russians who have left. So gender politics are increasingly important. Women do not like many of the policies of this regime and the intrusion into their everyday lives, from abortion policy to lack of defense against violence, domestic violence, and so on. So that to me is a line where, while I don't think that Russia's totalitarian, the line of interference in everyday life is shifting, and it's along gender lines. And I think it's part of why we see protests being feminized in Russia. So, and let me just speak briefly about democracy. I think the prospects for democracy in the next decade are very, very small, right? What we should have learned from the 1990s is that democracy takes a long time to build in a lot of infrastructure. And it may not look like the infrastructure that was existent in West Europe or the US. That infrastructure doesn't exist in Russia. It's been part of my argument that one of the big threats to Putin in 2021, 2022, before the war, was that that infrastructure was beginning to emerge, that societal capacity in Russia to self-organize, to pursue goals in politics was changing slowly but surely over the decade, even in the face of repression. Those things have been put on hold. And so the idea that there is a constituency among the elite for accountability, responsiveness in any real way seems really small, and the capacity for society to organize to sustain that is also very small. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of uncertainty within society and about what could happen. And I just want to make one last point and not go on too long. But in all of the points where we say, oh, society has surprised us, we have seen cascades of participation. So events kick off and new people join. And that's, I think, something that's still notable and remarkable. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Regina. I want to pass it over to Irina. Is there anything I mean, you can answer whatever you want, but in particular, is there anything in this emerging model, that you point to in your Ponar's memo that, might contain germs of less centralized power and more of a movement away from centralized control?
Thank you very much, Josh. Yes, I would like to make several points, but I would like to be as brief as possible, right? So this is what is needed.
Irina, can you come a little closer to the microphone?
It's better now?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so now I'm almost on the screen. But okay. I mean, so this is do we have some, some things in the model which could be which would lead to the possible model erosion of the center-regional relations? If so, then this is the kind of the accumulation of these probably new qualities of the governance. So this is what we tried to show in our Ponas memo, that this is the social necessities, to be more responsive to your local population, which was not previously the case, but now it is the case. This is because of the war. But from the other point, these are the special groups. These are the special groups. These are not the responsiveness to the total of the regional population, but to the social group. So probably it's too early to say. But I would also like to take a little bit part in this discussion about the tyranny of the present and the other things. And I think first of all, I think it's a very good expression. That tyranny of present, it's like there is kind of no future, and like the Russian establishment force you not to be in the future. You're all the time in the present. However, I don't think this is nicely said, but I'm not sure that this is the case, because I believe, and forgive me for this banality, but still I believe that with the war, the new page was opened in Russia in a way, and the war is the future. So this is the future, in fact, that the majority of the Russian population tolerated and tolerate, because because if the war and the fight is the future, the mobilization, the internal mobilization of the forces of the Russian population and so on, is the future. The non-normality is the future, because Putin was kind of, his first idea, I think, speculations, but still, in his two first terms, was the state building. The state building. I am the state builder. I am the Peter the Great. Okay. But now the idea, this is from the kind of the level of his country. This is now the global idea. This is the fight with the eternal enemy, for the existential threat for Russia. This is the future. So I think it is in a way it is the future, and this is the collective future. And this is kind of, probably we would need to make a distinction between individual futures and how the people, the Russian citizens, think about the individual future and the collective future. And the idea is there are not the priority to the collective future, right? And my last point is this is about the Mikhail Filipov question. What would be kind of should Russia be treated as a North Korea, or should Russia be treated kind of as a country which would democratize, and so on and so forth? I think these two things, this dichotomy, is simply wrong, because in my way, because to think that Russia can be treated as a North Korea it's not feasible. It cannot be, it cannot happen. However, the idea that the Russia could be in 10 years, in how many years could be democratized and be a genuine democracy and put, at this stake, it would be naive. So one is not feasible. The first option is not feasible. The second option is naive. I don't know how to navigate between these two, and this is the complexity. Thank you.
Sam?
Yeah, very briefly, just to make things even more complex than Irina just did on Mikhail's question. I think there's a question for Western governments about what our priorities are, right? Whether what we want to prioritize is democratization in Russia, or whether what we want to prioritize is normalization with Europe and Ukraine. Because I can see a scenario in which we get a government that comes post-Putin and actually decides to hand back territory to Ukraine and pay reparations. It's not likely, but it's plausible. But it's only plausible, I think, in a situation where that government doesn't have to compete in an election, in a free and fair election, right? If it controls the media, if it controls the Duma, if it can suppress those people who have bought the line that Putin has sold them, right, then it can pivot in that direction. But it remains a repressive and authoritarian government. Whereas anybody who has to compete and win an election has to win the votes of people who, have, by and large, bought into this war. And I think that augurs against Russia going in the direction that we would like. And so, there are trade-offs, and Western governments are going to have to think long and hard about what our priorities are.
Great. So let's go to a couple of themes in the questions from one attendee in the chat. And one of them asks about the anti-war presidential candidate, Vladislav Ivankov. And another related question to the panel, what about demands from wives, mothers, families of Russian soldiers, casualties of the war dead, to shift the popular narrative about the war? And I think this gets back to both electoral politics, the gendered nature of the shifts that we're seeing. Is there an actual constituency for the war, or has that even been cut off? And I'm particularly sort of interested also in whether, there were some allusions made to a possible regional dimension, which again seems to have been cut out at the inception. Do we see any variation across the Russian Federation on ground swelling movements in response to the war, if not in opposition to the war, in response to the war? And let me direct that to whoever wants to take it. Regina, do you want to take a stab at it? And then perhaps we can also go to Brian on this.
Sure. So first of all, on the candidacy, I make the analogy between this candidate and Sobchak in the last elections, right? So Putin always places himself in the middle of ballot construction. He wants to make sure that people aren't voting for an anti-war candidate. So he puts a very unknown candidate and someone who's already been discredited. And the discrediting here is from the New People's Party. So if we remember there was some excitement about this party as a new voice and maybe a change, and there's always this hope that comes with it. The party has been proven to be not significant. So they'll allow a little bit of a non-sure attitude about the war in order to discredit that kind of thinking on the ballot, right? So it's strategic, and we've seen this before. I think that there are some very interesting things happening on the ground in Russia around containing war speech. And this is something actually Anton Chirikov is writing about, right? So a lot of this discussion is taking place online. It's taking place among local and regional women's groups who are making demands, as Ira said, on their regional governments. But it's also being countered by state narratives and state women who work for the state or are wives of the state who are in engagement with them about their concerns. And there's a very strong message coming out that says, be patient, toe the line that women toed in World War II. There's very much a building of a model of how women should be behaving in this period. And here, I think it's in some ways fueling the fire of feminist, or not feminist, because remember, we don't, that's not what this is, but gender discontent that has to do with women feeling like they are being ignored and ridiculed in some ways by promoting false voices over the true voices, and using these old narratives. And so I think that this is driving a little bit the feminization of discontent, the abandonment of Putin by some of women who used to be strongly in his core. But it reflects the incentives that Ira is talking about building local constituencies and responding to demands.
Great, thanks very much. Brian, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. A couple quick thoughts. First of all, in terms of Ivankov, the candidate from New People, first of all, I would say I don't see him as an anti-war candidate. He's really not wanted to talk about it. He has a kind of different, kind of technocratic, economic reform sort of agenda. But a reminder that he is not the leader of the party. Allegedly, from some reporting, the leader of the party, Nechayev, didn't want to be on the ballot. And we also saw the same thing on the communist side, where Zyuganov apparently didn't want to be on the ballot. So they had to, drag Kharitonov out to put him on the ballot. The two, they've both been mentioned, Duntsova and Nadezhdin, but the anti-war candidates were deliberately kept off the ballot. And in the case of Nadezhdin, the phenomenon was lasting enough that Russian Field managed to get out a poll on it, and he quickly, according to their results, got 10% support, and that was going to wreck, the 80+% that they're hoping to deliver for Putin, and so he had to be, not allowed on the ballot. And to the extent that they allowed him to go as far as they did, it was probably a mistake, and Kiriyenko probably took some heat for not recognizing the threat early enough, but I don't see the election as a chance to direct that. Now, it is interesting what opposition-minded people will do at the election. Will they go vote for Davankov as the worst of all evils? I actually think maybe in the aftermath of the murder of Navalny that people will be more inclined to just spoil their ballot and write his name on it or something like that, rather than vote for one of the non-Putin candidates. But it's hard to know, given electronic voting, given voting in the occupied territories, if we'll have a real sense of what the actual votes were anyway. So I wouldn't go too far on that. In terms of the second question about regional disparities, I should defer to others, but I would note, and this is probably well known to many people listening, that the impact of mobilization in the war hits very differently across Russia, given how different Russia is as a federation, right? Places like Moscow and St. Petersburg are less touched by the mobilization. The high salaries being paid for people who volunteer don't matter as much to people in those cities as they do in the poorer regions. So you can see from what we know about the casualty rates and things like that, that it's the poorer regions that are supplying more of the fighters. And from the Kremlin point of view, that seems politically safer as well.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder. So we are almost at time, but I do want to take one more question and also ask Irina to respond. So I want to go to this question from longtime attendee Linda Tucker, who asked at the 2022 Train Foundation Civil Courage Award ceremony, Maria Pepchik of Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation says that the Russian leaders were a bunch of old men and that she and her cohort were the future. How should we view that now? So I think we will end with Sam on that one. I'm going to put him on the spot for that. But first, Irina, let's go to that. You can answer the Navalny question. Certainly, we'd like to get your input too on the question about regions and anti-war sentiment and protests. And then we're going to have to call it. So 2 minutes each, please.
No? Can you hear me? You can hear me, right? So, thank you very much. I think these two questions, about Davankov, the new people, and the mothers and wives of those mobilized to the front, they are connected to each other, because this group of women, they wrote a letter to him, an open letter to Davankov. So what? Because they got no answer from the Kremlin, I would say, right? And so they tried to use this opportunity. Do you know what was the response? The response, first it was no response, and then what was next? No response, and then the response was no, потерпите немножко, да? So you should be patient, So this is I absolutely agree with Brian that he is not an anti-war candidate, not at all. And this is the whole party, and I tend to believe that the whole party is a Kremlin project. I don't have the evidence, but it looks like this. This is diversion, slightly for these people. And I also agree with Brian about the asymmetry. The asymmetry of this kind of the spread of this żony materies, of the mothers and the wives, not only across Russia's regions, but this is also internal eclectic inside this movement. because this is the minority in this movement who are against the war. The others are not for the end of the war, but for return our men, return our sons from the war. So let's do the change. You know, it's not about the ending of the war, but at the same time, it gives, you know, kind of harder time for the center, for Moscow to declare them as illegal, as bad, and so on and so forth, because they are not against the war, and this is against this. It's a paradox in a way, because you cannot just stop them because they're not against the war, but at the same time you cannot fulfill their requirements because the demobilization не предусмотрена. So the demobilization is not going on. But still, this is okay. I don't see it as a kind of political force or something, but this is as Regina said, this is in a way important, it's interesting, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sam, you'll get the last word.
So let me come back to something Regina said at the very, very beginning of all of this, right? Which is that this election is not about picking the president. This is a ritual of participation in an authoritarian community, right? And as a result, for the vast majority of the people who participate in it, it is about communicating their membership in a part of that political community, either in the majority or in the minority, depending on where they stand. But it's not about picking somebody who's going to pursue policies that you like. It's about the safety in numbers and the embeddedness that that is important to you in this environment, in an environment that makes it very dangerous to be in the minority, right? So to the question of whether Navalny's group is the future, what they have to do is, unfortunately, two things. It's not just what they've traditionally tried to do, is to prove to people that if you were to put other people in power, right, if you were to get rid of United Russia, get rid of Putin, that things could plausibly change. And there's always been a minority of Russian citizens who believed that to be true. But the immediate task is to get people out of this state of fear, right? Out of the sense that what really matters is safety in numbers, and to begin to think about voting in a way that is instrumental. And I'm afraid it's going to take a very long time before that is possible.
Thanks, Sam. Let me thank all of you again for joining us here today. I want to thank everybody in our audience for taking some of your time to join us today. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I know I learned a tremendous amount from this conversation. I feel like we could easily have scheduled this for 3 hours and have had plenty to discuss here. So apologies to those of you who had questions that we didn't get to. But for the panelists, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been incredibly informative. Our next New York City Russia Public Policy event will be on April 17th in April. And on behalf of Alex, my original full-time partner in this, and now who comes back occasionally for these, it's been a real pleasure having you here. But on behalf of the two of us, thank you all for joining us. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to the panelists. And we'll hopefully see many of you at future Harriman and Jordan Center events, as well as at the next New York City Russia Public Policy Online on April 17th. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.